It was supposed to be the perfect fairy tale. A hooker, a millionaire, and the city of angels glowing like gold under a California sunset. Pretty Woman was the movie that made the world believe in modern love, a street Cinderella story where dreams wore high heels and smiled through loneliness. But behind that smile, behind Julia Roberts' disarming innocence and Richard Gere's icy charm, there existed a version of the story that Hollywood buried deep, a version so dark that no one was ever supposed to talk about it. In 1989, before Disney sanitized the script, Pretty Woman was called $3,000, the price Edward was to pay Vivian for 1 week. There were no diamonds, no red dresses, no happy ending under the stars. There was addiction, despair, and the cold truth of transactional love in the city's underbelly. It was not a fantasy. It was a warning. The original ending? Vivian gets thrown out of Edward's car, the cash crumpled in her hand, as he drives away into the neon night. She walks back to the streets she came from. That's how the real story ended, not with a kiss, but with silence. Hollywood didn't want silence. It wanted a song. The executives at Disney's Touchstone Pictures feared that no one would buy tickets to a story about a prostitute dying inside. They wanted something that could charm middle America, something that could sell lunchboxes and soundtracks. So, they brought in Gary Marshall, a director known for heart, humor, and human hope, and told him to make people believe. And with that single word, everything changed. The darker scenes, Vivian being addicted to cocaine, her roommate dying from overdose, the argument that turned violent in a motel room, were quietly cut. The rewrites were surgical. The pain was replaced with polish. Vivian no longer needed saving from drugs, just from loneliness. Edward was no longer a cold-hearted corporate raider. He was a lost prince in a suit. The knife of truth was dulled by the soft velvet of fantasy. Julia Roberts was only 21, a newcomer with freckles and a tremor of fear in her eyes. She was supposed to play pain, not perfection. On the set, the whispers spread. The studio doesn't want darkness. They want a dream. Richard Gere hesitated to take the role, calling it a transactional fantasy for men, until the rewrites made Edward human, not hollow. Every line, every smile, was rewritten to fit the illusion. But the camera remembers what the scissors don't. Beneath the laughter, beneath the music, you can still feel the ghost of that first script, $3,000 bleeding under a silk title card. For a second, when Julia looks out the window, lost between luxury and shame, she's not Vivian the fantasy. She's Vivian the forgotten. What no one was supposed to talk about until now is how Pretty Woman wasn't born from love. It was born from the fear of truth. And every fairy tale that sells must first burn the pages that don't fit the dream. Before Pretty Woman became a fantasy wrapped in pearls, it was born in a world far more cruel and far more honest. The man who wrote it, J.F. Lawton, wasn't thinking about love, luxury, or laughter. He was thinking about the women he saw every night on Hollywood Boulevard, walking through the neon fog, trading dignity for survival. Lawton lived near those streets in the late 80s. He watched girls get picked up, dropped off, and forgotten before dawn. He called his script $3,000, because that's what it cost for 1 week of pretending someone cared. In his original story, Vivian Ward wasn't the bright, bubbly dream that Julia Roberts embodied. She was broken, raw, and trapped in addiction. She wasn't a symbol of hope. She was a reflection of Los Angeles's underbelly. Her world was full of broken mirrors and fluorescent lights, and the men who passed through her life didn't offer redemption, only repetition. Lawton didn't write her to be rescued. He wrote her to survive. That was his truth. A street tragedy. Not a love story. But truth rarely sells in Hollywood. By the time $3,000 landed in the hands of the producers at Touchstone Pictures, Disney's adult-oriented subsidiary, the transformation began. Gary Marshall, the director brought in to soften the story, came from sitcoms like Happy Days and Laverne and Shirley. He understood heartbreak, but he also understood how to hide it behind a smile. When he read the script, he reportedly said, "There's a beating heart here, but it's drowning in sorrow. Let's give it some air." That air came at a cost. The entire first act was rewritten. The scenes where Vivian's friend Kit overdoses or where Vivian hides her track marks with makeup were deleted. The ending, the one where Edward rejects her and drives away, was burned. In its place, a new one was written. The knight in the limousine climbing the fire escape to save his modern-day princess. The movie that was once about pain became a celebration of possibility. Julia Roberts, then a young actress from Georgia, was still unknown to most of Hollywood. She had grown up in a struggling family of performers. Her parents ran a small theater school that often couldn't pay its bills. Her childhood was far from glamorous. She learned early what it meant to fake happiness for an audience. When she read for the part of Vivian, she wasn't the studio's first choice. They had approached others, Michelle Pfeiffer, Daryl Hannah, even Meg Ryan, all of whom turned it down because the role was too dirty, too sad. But Julia saw something different. She didn't see shame. She saw a woman trying to feel alive. Her audition was electric. Gary Marshall later recalled that Julia walked into the room like she'd lived the story already. She was shy and strong, funny and fragile, all at once. That duality became the key. She wasn't the Vivian from the streets, nor the Vivian from the fairy tale. She was both. And so, the transformation of $3,000 into Pretty Woman mirrored the transformation of Julia Roberts herself. A young woman with no map, no money, and no protection in a city that devours dreams, suddenly chosen to embody hope. Yet, the irony lingered. The movie that saved her career was built on a script about a girl no one wanted to save. Few people knew that behind the curtain of this romantic blockbuster was a team of writers and executives rewriting not just lines, but lives, changing endings, softening scars, turning realism into romance. It was Hollywood's oldest magic trick. Take the pain, polish it, and sell it back as happiness. By the time the cameras rolled, the streets that once terrified Lawton's eye imagination were replaced with sets bathed in golden light. But the ghosts of those original pages stayed. You could still feel them beneath Julia's laughter, hidden in her eyes, because she, too, came from a place where the smile was often just survival. When the cameras began rolling in the spring of 1989, no one, not the crew, not Gary Marshall, not even Julia Roberts herself believed they were creating a legend. Pretty Woman was a gamble. The studio still felt uneasy about its premise. A corporate tycoon falling for a prostitute. In an era obsessed with clean-cut heroes and safe narratives, it was a story that could either collapse under its own taboo or rewrite the rules entirely. What saved it wasn't luck. It was chemistry, volatile, fragile, electric chemistry between two people who almost didn't say yes. Richard Gere had refused the role several times. He found Edward Lewis flat, even soulless. "He's just another Wall Street shark," he once said. "Why would anyone root for him?" But Gary Marshall had a knack for pairing opposites and turning them into fire. He arranged a meeting between Gere and Roberts in a New York hotel. Julia, nervous and still a newcomer, sat across from him with wide, unguarded eyes. The conversation was awkward until she scribbled a note on a piece of paper and slid it to him. It read, "Please say yes." Gere smiled. Marshall clapped his hands and shouted, "We have a movie!" From that moment, the transformation began. Julia's rawness, that nervous laughter, that uncertain smile. It wasn't acting. It was instinct. On set, she was often overwhelmed, some at times to tears. There's a famous scene where Edward snaps the jewelry box shut and Vivian bursts into laughter. It wasn't scripted. Gere had done it as a prank, and the pure joy on Julia's face became one of the most iconic moments in film history. Gary Marshall kept it in because it was real. Hollywood was watching something rare. An actress who didn't perform love, she radiated it. She didn't play Vivian Ward, she became her. A woman who didn't belong in Edward's world, but refused to be ashamed of her own. Roberts carried vulnerability like armor, soft but unbreakable. The movie hit theaters in March 1990, and the world exploded. Pretty Woman didn't just succeed, it redefined romantic cinema. It became the highest-grossing romantic comedy ever made at the TIMA, grossing nearly $500 million worldwide. The theme song, Roy Orbison's "Oh, Pretty Woman," echoed from radios in every city, and Julia Roberts, the small-town girl with an uneven laugh and big dreams, became America's sweetheart overnight. But that title came with a shadow. Overnight fame is rarely a blessing. Julia was suddenly the face of optimism in a world that demanded perfection. Yet, she knew, better than anyone, that her stardom was built on a lie, a rewritten story that silenced the darkness she had once understood so well. Interviews were carefully managed. Questions about the film's original script were brushed aside. She smiled, she laughed, and she hid the truth that the movie's happy ending had cost something deeply human. Behind the glimmer, the studio's decision-makers toasted to their success. Disney had transformed a grim social drama into a box-office miracle. And yet, there was quiet tension. J.F. Lawton, the original writer, watched as his gritty screenplay became a polished fantasy. He didn't protest publicly. He was proud, yes, but haunted. "They made a better movie," he once admitted, "but not the one I wrote." Meanwhile, Roberts continued her climb. The same vulnerability that made her magnetic in Pretty Woman became her trademark. Steel Magnolias, Sleeping with the Enemy, My Best Friend's Wedding. Each role painted her as the eternal optimist. But in her private life, the narrative was far less magical. The line between Julia and Vivian blurred, as if Hollywood had decided she would forever be the woman saved by love, never the one left behind. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest irony of all, that the woman who gave the world its favorite fairy tale would spend the next decade proving she didn't need rescuing. By the early 1990 seconds, Pretty Woman was no longer just a film, it was an empire. The image of Julia Roberts in that red dress, stepping into the Beverly Wilshire lobby with a smile that could melt marble, became a symbol of cinematic perfection. Every magazine cover, every late-night show, every Hollywood Awards gala echoed the same phrase, "America's sweetheart." Yet for those who had touched the film's darker beginnings, that title tasted bittersweet. They knew what had been erased to make it so sweet. Disney capitalized on the fantasy. Posters showed love, conquering class, shame, and cynicism. Julia's face glowed. Richard Gere stood calm and invincible beside her. But in the studio vaults, there remained reels of film. No one spoke of fragments of the original story. Scenes filmed before the rewrites fully took hold. A few insiders whispered that Julia had once filmed a sequence in a grim motel, showing Vivian relapsing into despair after Edward leaves. Another rumored scene showed her friend Kit collapsing from an overdose, her lipstick smudged on a dirty pillow. They were too real, too tragic, and too close to the truth. Gary Marshall fought to keep one or two of them for texture. "I need people to remember she's human," he told the editors, but most of those moments were cut, lost under the gloss. Julia was now the face of Hollywood optimism, but behind the scenes, she was uneasy with that label. In interviews, when journalists asked about her meteoric rise, she smiled politely and deflected. "Vivian made people happy," she'd say, "and that's all I could ever hope for." Yet there was something in her tone, a hint of dissonance. Friends recalled how she often revisited those early days of filming, wondering aloud how different the story could have been if the studio had kept Lawton's darker ending. Richard Gere felt it too. Though the film made him a household name, he spoke of Edward Lewis as a ghost, saying, "He was never meant to be the hero. We just turned him into one." In private, he admitted the movie's tone shift troubled him. "We wanted to tell a story about loneliness, but we ended up telling one about salvation. Maybe people prefer lies that make them feel good." And the audience did. They consumed the lie willingly. Women saw hope. Men saw redemption. Hollywood saw profit. But the original truth of Pretty Woman began to leak out not through scandal, but through art. J.F. Lawton's unedited script circulated in underground film schools. Aspiring directors whispered, "Did you read $3,000? It's brutal. It's real." The contrast between the script and the final cut became a legend of its own, a metaphor for Hollywood itself, the place where pain gets rewritten into pleasure. Julia's fame reached its zenith. By 1991, she was commanding million-dollar salaries, a rarity for women at the time. Sleeping with the Enemy cemented her star power, but the shadow of Vivian Ward lingered in every frame. She had become the template, the flawed, beautiful woman the world wanted to rescue. Yet, in private, Julia was growing exhausted by the expectation to always smile, to always be the dream. Her relationships faltered under the weight of that image. The woman who had embodied a fairy tale now struggled to believe in one herself. On the 10th anniversary of Pretty Woman, Gary Marshall was asked in an interview if he ever regretted cutting the darker material. He paused. "I don't regret making people happy," he said softly. "But sometimes I wonder if we robbed them of the truth. And that's the paradox that still haunts Hollywood, the realization that the movie, which made millions believe in love, was born from a script that wanted to make them believe in survival. The forbidden scenes were more than edits. They were confessions. They showed a world where love didn't conquer pain, where money couldn't buy redemption, and where even a pretty woman could still be invisible. What remains most haunting is that Julia Roberts herself, radiant, vulnerable, untouchable, carried that lost truth in her eyes long after the cameras stopped. Because no matter how much light you pour onto a fairy tale, its shadow never really disappears. The higher the light, the darker the shadow. And for Julia Roberts, that shadow came early. By the mid-1990 seconds, she was no longer just an actress. She was a symbol, a market, a living myth, built on the illusion of Pretty Woman. Hollywood had turned her laugh into a currency, and her vulnerability into a product. Every magazine wanted the same story: the smile, the love, the miracle. But off-camera, Julia began to feel what Vivian once felt, the suffocating weight of being wanted for a fantasy. The transformation of $3,000 into Pretty Woman hadn't just rewritten a movie. It had rewritten Julia's life. The studio machine demanded she remain the radiant girl who could make even sin look wholesome. Directors sought her for variations of Vivian women, broken but beautiful, needing to be saved. She resisted. But the world kept calling her back to the same hotel room on Hollywood Boulevard. The irony was cruel. She had escaped the script, yet the character followed her everywhere. The industry's obsession reached its peak during the press tours for her next films. She smiled for cameras, while tabloids devoured her personal life, failed engagements, on-set feuds, loneliness, dressed in designer gowns. Rumors painted her as difficult, emotional, unstable. The very warmth that made her famous was now recast as weakness. Reporters asked her about Pretty Woman like it was a prophecy. "Did it change your life?" And she would answer, softly, "It changed how people saw me. That's not the same thing." Behind that controlled smile, Julia was unraveling. Friends said she feared being trapped by her own success, that she often replayed scenes from Pretty Woman not out of nostalgia, but guilt for what had been erased. People forget it was supposed to be a tragedy. She told one interviewer years later, "We all turned it into a dream because that's what the world wanted to buy." She wasn't condemning the film, she was confessing to its consequences. And those consequences rippled through Hollywood. The sanitized version of Pretty Woman created a new formula: the hooker with a heart of gold, the male savior, the glossy redemption arc. It spawned dozens of imitations, each one softer, safer, emptier. The forbidden scenes of $3,000 became the ghosts haunting an entire genre. No one wanted to show the dirt anymore, only the diamond. Julia's breaking point came quietly. On the set of Mary Riley in 1996, she collapsed from exhaustion. The media called it stress. Her friends called it heartbreak. Years of suppressing fear behind that luminous smile had hollowed her out. She stepped back from public life, avoiding interviews, rejecting projects that felt too clean, too false. "I can't play the fantasy anymore," she reportedly told a close friend. At the same TMA, whispers about Pretty Woman's original footage began to resurface. A former editor claimed the deleted scenes still existed, locked in a vault at Disney. Gary Marshall, pressed about them, only smiled sadly. "Some stories are better left as secrets," he said. But the internet age had arrived, and secrets no longer stayed buried. Early drafts of $3,000 leaked online. Fans were stunned to discover the crueler version. Vivian, addicted to cocaine. Edward, cruel and distant. The ending cruelly abrupt. For many, it was like discovering the bones beneath a painted statue. The public's reaction split in two. Some felt betrayed their beloved fairy tale, exposed as manipulation. Others found new respect for Julia Roberts, realizing the depth she had hinted at beneath the gloss. For her, it was liberation. She didn't deny the darkness anymore. She began to embrace it in her later roles. Erin Brockovich, Closer, August, Osage County characters who bled, cursed, and broke. Each one was a piece of Vivian Ward restored to her original truth. But Hollywood never forgets its icons, nor the myths it needs them to uphold. Julia would forever carry the ghost of that first smile, that forbidden laughter in the jewelry box. It made her immortal, but it also made her a prisoner. The price of becoming Pretty Woman was simple: to lose the right to ever be anything else. By the time the millennium arrived, Pretty Woman was canon, a fairy tale burned into global memory. But like every illusion that shines too long, its reflection began to crack. Hollywood storytellers, critics, and even audiences started to re-watch it with new eyes. They saw not just the red dress and the limousine, but the quiet erasures hiding beneath them. And at the center of it all stood Julia Roberts, both the benefactor and the victim of a masterpiece that had rewritten truth itself. The consequences of Pretty Woman extended far beyond one actress or one studio. It became a cultural script, a template for how women were supposed to be portrayed: beautiful, broken, but redeemable through male attention. The dark, unfiltered reality of survival, sex, addiction, and systemic exploitation was replaced with something marketable, something digestible. For an entire generation, the film romanticized power imbalance. Men saw salvation, women saw hope, but hidden in that hope was a quiet warning that a woman's worth could still be bought, polished, and sold back as love. Hollywood learned that lesson too well. For decades after, romantic comedies mimicked the same structure, the same dynamic, the same lie wrapped in laughter. Films like Runaway Bride, Made in Manhattan, and Notting Hill carried fragments of Vivian Ward's DNA, recycled through softer filters. It was the fantasy of transformation without trauma, the dream of being chosen rather than surviving. The forbidden scenes of $3,000 became a ghost story told in private, whispered in classrooms, referenced in essays, but never publicly acknowledged by the studios that built empires from its ashes. Julia Roberts, however, refused to stay a symbol. In the early 2000s, she made a choice that stunned everyone. She began dismantling her own myth. With Erin Brockovich, she turned her cinematic smile into a weapon no longer a mask, but a defiance. She played a woman who fought, swore, struggled, and refused to be pretty for anyone's comfort. That role earned her an Oscar, but more than that, it exorcised a ghost. For once, Julia wasn't being rescued. She was doing the saving. Off-screen, she grew more selective, more private. The interviews became rarer. When journalists inevitably circled back to Pretty Woman, she didn't deny its magic, but she didn't pretend it was innocent either. "We told a story people needed at the TMA," she said in one rare moment of candor. "But if we made it today, I'd ask different questions." That sentence carried more weight than a confession. It was a reckoning. The reckoning wasn't hers alone. Film historians began unearthing the original drafts of $3,000, publishing comparisons that shocked readers. One critic wrote, "What Disney cut wasn't profanity, it was pain." The missing scenes, now legend, became a metaphor for an industry built on omission. It wasn't that Hollywood lied. It simply edited until the truth was comfortable. Even Gary Marshall, near the end of his life, hinted at regret. In an interview shortly before his death, he said, "I wanted to show that love could heal, but maybe I should have shown that truth hurts too." His words echoed across generations of filmmakers who began revisiting the line between storytelling and sanitization. In the quiet corners of the internet, cinephiles traded rare script pages. Vivian, in tears after being kicked out of Edward's car. Kit's overdose in a shadowed motel. Edward's cold indifference. Each line was a glimpse into the movie that almost was, the one that would have shattered illusions instead of selling them. Julia Roberts, now older and wiser, no longer chased perfection. Her beauty, still luminous, had hardened into something timeless, not the glow of innocence, but the gravity of understanding. She had lived long enough to see the industry that once idolized her begin to question itself. And in that reflection, she found peace. She was no longer just the pretty woman, she was the witness. The forbidden scenes had vanished from reels, but not from memory. They lived on as whispers, essays, and quiet protests. They became the reminder that every frame of cinema is a choice to show or to hide, to comfort or to confront. And in the end, perhaps that's the true legacy of Pretty Woman. Not the kiss on the fire escape, not the diamonds or the dress, but the silence it left behind. The silence where the real story used to be. Decades have passed since Pretty Woman painted the dream that never was. The film still plays on television screens, its laughter still sweet, its soundtrack still a heartbeat of the early 90s. For millions, it remains comfort, the kind of movie that ends the way people wish life would. But beneath that comfort, the forbidden version still breathes. It whispers through film schools, feminist essays, and interviews where silence speaks louder than nostalgia. And it asks one simple question: what are we really in love with, the story or the illusion? Hollywood still hasn't answered. Each generation rediscovers Pretty Woman, not as a love story, but as a case study in transformation of narrative, of morality, of commerce. The fact that it was ever meant to end in despair is now a piece of cinematic folklore, half remembered, half denied. Yet its influence remains impossible to erase. Every romantic comedy that follows the girl rescued by love arc owes something to its shadow. The fairy tale became a formula, and the formula became an industry. For Julia Roberts, the legacy is double-edged. Pretty Woman made her immortal. But immortality, in Hollywood, often means you stop being real. She has said little about the film in recent years, perhaps because there's nothing left to explain. It was the role that gave her the world, and took a part of her in return. When asked whether she'd ever reprise Vivian Ward, she smiled softly and said, "Vivian got out alive. Let's not drag her back. There was wisdom in that restraint, the understanding that some stories, no matter how adored, are better left untouched. Richard Gere, too, eventually distanced himself from Edward Lewis. In later interviews, he admitted that the film's romantic idealism didn't reflect reality. "If you peel back the charm," he said, "it's still a story about loneliness, two people trying to fill a hole with money and affection." The candor was refreshing, almost jarring, after decades of glossy retrospectives. It revealed what the forbidden scenes had once screamed. Pretty Woman was never about love. It was about longing, the human need to be seen, even in the ugliest corners of life. And yet, perhaps that's why the movie endures. Beneath all the edits and rewrites, it still touches something universal. Vivian Ward, as rewritten and romanticized as she was, embodied a truth that even Disney's polish couldn't erase: the hunger for dignity. People didn't fall in love with the fantasy of being rescued. They fell in love with the idea that someone like her could be worthy of a fairy tale. In that paradox, the film found its power. It lied beautifully, but inside the lie was a wound that everyone recognized. In the years since, filmmakers have revisited the concept with more honesty. Movies like Moulin Rouge, Pretty Baby, and Hustlers peeled away the glamour to reveal the pain. They were, in a way, the cinematic grandchildren of $3,000, reclaiming the authenticity that had once been cut. And every time a story dared to show the unpretty side of survival, it was as if a piece of the forbidden footage flickered back to life. For Hollywood, the lesson is as uncomfortable as it is essential. The industry thrives on reinvention, yet it fears truth more than failure. Pretty Woman's greatest legacy may not be its success, but its absence, the film it chose not to be. It stands as a mirror, reflecting a business that still edits pain into pleasure and calls it progress. For Julia Roberts, that mirror became a map. She built a career that slowly redefined what pretty meant. It wasn't the dress, the hair, or the smile. It was resilience. When she returned to the screen in roles like Erin Brockovich or August Osage County, audiences saw not a fantasy, but a survivor. The laughter was still there, but it no longer hid the scars. It honored them. And so, the forbidden scenes remain unseen, unspoken, but never truly gone. They exist in the collective imagination, haunting the edges of a story too perfect to be true. Maybe that's what great art does. It hides its darkest truth inside its brightest light. In the end, Pretty Woman endures not because it told us what love is, but because it revealed, even through its omissions, what love costs. The fairy tale made millions believe in transformation, but the truth, the one locked away in those missing reels, reminds us that not every woman gets rescued, not every pain finds redemption, and not every story gets to stay beautiful once the lights go out. Somewhere, in a vault that may or may not still exist, lies the uncut ending, Vivian walking away alone, clutching her $3,000, swallowed by neon and noise. It's not romantic. It's not perfect. But maybe, just maybe, it's the most honest love story Hollywood ever refused to tell.